Okay, all right. Okay. Goodness. Confusing. Sorry, my lords. Firstly, apologies that I was unable to be with you at second reading, but I did read the excellent contributions in Hansard and listening today, and it confirmed that I really do, like everyone else, want to commend the noble Lord, Lord Woodley of Wallasey, for this private members' bill. I think it's done a huge amount at, yet once more, raising the issue. I have to say about the noble Lord, Lord Woodley, he's one of those thorn in the side type of people, you know, awkward squad, and that's the greatest compliment I can give him, because I think that's how things change. Important issues have already been raised, and I do want to, and I didn't speak in the first group for time purposes, so I'll kind of bring some of it forward, to say that I think that Lord Woodley's approach to this resentencing exercise is refreshing, because what he's been offering to do is to do whatever he can to ensure that it is not, as too often caricatured, turned into some sort of a chaotic mess with inadequate oversight. And instead, what we're all looking for through all these amendments is to use whatever mechanisms we can to convert these never-ending IPP sentences into regular, normal, determinate sentences with an end in sight. And that means that we're prepared to make compromises, to look at all options. Nothing's off the table. And in that spirit, rather than treating all IPP prisoners as an undifferentiated blob, I'm glad to see that today's amendments are trying to tackle the different cohorts within the IPP population and work out how best to deal with each group reasonably and maybe differently to edge towards justice. The focus of my amendment, Amendment 7, are those IPP prisoners suffering mental illness, giving the resentencing court the power to continue incarceration if someone still presents a risk to the public, but due to mental disorder they may be dangerous. This will effectively replace an IPP sentence with a secure hospital order. It's a backstop safeguard for the government to use in dealing with one difficult group of IPPers. One key context for this, and we've heard it again and again here from the front bench on both sides of the House, is that the noble Lord Timpson, in explaining his resistance to resentencing, stresses, quote, "The first priority and responsibility of any government is to protect the public, and therefore the focus will always be and continually be on public safety." I'm actually not convinced myself that that's not too crude a measure of the government's main priority is always to protect the public. But regardless, it seems that the MOJ are fixated, perhaps even paralysed, with the notion of dangerousness and IPPs. I've never been convinced by the argument that IPPs are en masse a distinct group of offenders who are especially dangerous, so much more dangerous than other prisoners on determinate sentences for far more heinous crimes, often released into the community at their sentence end regardless, or indeed let out on early release to solve the state's prison crisis. And I do want to just take the chance here to cite a letter I received from one IPP prisoner talking of his frustration of seeing early release prisoners walking out every day, laughing and joking, having told prison officers to shove their sentence plan, boasting about how they're going to earn 100 times more than prison officers by selling Class A, having had adjudication for alcohol, phones, drugs, violence, cell destruction, all wiped clean, and yet they still get an early release. And my correspondent pointed out that IPPs are almost choir boys in comparison, but they're left to rot. However, I will concede that one risk factor that makes hundreds of IPP prisoners not choir boys is that the very nature of the IPP sentence is so psychologically toxic that itself has damaged prisoners' mental health and caused problematic behaviour, and that's what I want to look at. This theme has been well rehearsed in all our debates in this chamber and is evidenced in all the literature. The despair and sense of hopelessness associated with this sentence, as we know, contributes to making some IPP prisoners so ill, and we know about the self-harm and suicide numbers that are appalling. What's more, ill IPP prisoners have a double whammy in as much as they're often wary of disclosing a decline in their mental health to prison staff in case it could knock back a parole hearing. So the IPP regime contributes to untreated illness with no intervention to stop deterioration, and that creates even more risky behaviour. The irony is that the prisoners are arguably becoming less safe to release precisely because they are being held indefinitely, creating so much pent-up anger and frustration and loss of agency with no hope. And that potent mix is leading to instability and people lashing out or disengagement, and all of that's a barrier to progressing release. But also it means that in the context of this bill, a percentage of IPPers could be too ill to be considered for resentencing. And this is partly because prisons are not the right location to deal with mental illness. Now, as the Noble Lord the Minister knows, the government has already agreed that prison is not the right setting for prisoners who are ill. And he knows that because it was an important element of the mental health bill that passed through the Lords, declaring that prisons should not be treated as places of safety. And I moved amendments on that issue with a focus actually on IPP prisoners as well during that bill's committee and report stages. So this amendment that I'm moving today follows up on that discussion. It acknowledges that as the punishment part of the sentence of an IPPer has long since been discharged, but where there's still concerns about risk and dangerousness because of mental health challenges, a mental health setting is more appropriate than prison. And that would allow the Resentencing Council to use hospital orders to ensure the public protection aspects of concerns are dealt with appropriately, but also making sure the prisoner is in the right setting. Where someone has become apparently not safe enough to release because of an illness that the state has helped to induce, this, it seems to me, is a reasonable and elegant solution. The way IPP sentenced individuals can access targeted help for their distress, have their deterioration in behaviour clinically managed, and this can allow progression via specialist, especially designed therapeutic and pharmacological inpatient care in a psychiatric setting that can hopefully build up and help recovery of ill individuals with dignity. Now, at the second reading, the Noble Lord, Lord Davis of Brixton, noted that 30% of IPP offenders are not in appropriate settings, a reality that the Noble Lord, Lord Timpson, conceded and said that the MOJ is addressing this, urgently working with HMPPS to make sure people are transferred to the best prisons to access interventions and services that will aid their rehabilitation. And it seems to me that my emphasis on moving mentally ill people into hospitals and using hospital orders is even more important when it comes to settings, and this is something I would urge to be an immediate priority. We have all, by the way, recently been celebrating the fact that finally and at last, Thomas White has been discharged from prison into a hospital cell and will now be a patient, not a prisoner. And Thomas White has been discussed in this House many times, but it just seems so depressing to me that we call that move of Thomas White from prison into a hospital a victory, when it's been such a hard and gruelling slog over 6 years, involving so many people's hard work and dedication to pull this off. The huge courage and campaigning of his sister Clara, the magnificent journalism of Amy Claire Martin at The Independent, the fact that his case has been continually raised by MPs and then peers in this House, and a special shout out to the Noble Lord, Lord Blunkett, for his personal interventions with the family, and full credit to the Noble Lord, the Minister, for visiting Mr White in March. But that is a huge amount of political intervention to get someone who was so obviously too ill for prison to get him into hospital. Mr Thomas developed paranoid schizophrenia while in custody as an IPP prisoner. He was repeatedly smashing his face on the floor of the maximum security HMP Manchester. He set himself on fire in his cell. 3 psychiatrists called for him to be moved to hospital. 2 medical reports warned his lengthy incarceration was creating impermeable barriers to his recovery. Yet he was repeatedly refused a hospital bed. So hurrah, he will now get appropriate treatment. What we can't continue depending on needing high-profile campaigns and massive political intervention for IPP prisoners to access what should be an obvious conclusion when they get ill. And if we stick with the status quo position, by the way, as somebody else has mentioned, then Mr Thomas...
Can I remind the noble lady the advisory speaking limit is 10 minutes for this debate?
OK. The status quo position is at the moment that Mr Thomas, when he becomes well and stable in hospital, will be returned to the prison again as an IPPer, and that seems unconscionable. All that this amendment does is suggest that people are referred, when they are mentally ill, to a hospital, that then the hospital uses a clinical assessment to decide when they are well, and when they are well, they can be not dangerous and released. That can be part of the resentencing procedure.
My Lords.